Copyright University of Auckland, all rights reserved. The content and delivery of lectures in this course are protected by copyright. Material belonging to others may have been used in these lectures and copied by and solely for the educational purposes of the university under license.
All right. Thank you all for coming, and welcome to this meeting of the Reason and Science Society. For this week, we've gotten Dr. Quentin who's going to talk about the topic, Is God an Adaptation? For next week, we're going to be having a talk by Dr. Nicholas Rattenbury on extrasolar planets, and also on the 9th of September, we'll be having a tertiary education debate with all the political parties, so if you're interested, we'll be sending out emails and Facebook updates on that, so keep in touch. Thanks.
Cool, thank you. And thank you all for coming out on a very rainy night. So I'm part of the Language, Cognition and Culture Lab in the Psychology Department, and the Reason and Science Society got in touch with me and asked if I wanted to give a talk, and I thought, well, maybe some of the work I'm doing, or some of the background on the work I'm doing on religion would be interesting for you guys to hear about. So here goes. This is one of my favorite quotes, and it's from the delightfully named Theodosius Dobzhansky. And he says, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." And what does he mean by that? Well, here's something that looks pretty weird. Studied in isolation, if you were maybe a biologist from another planet come to Earth, you see this. It's pretty strange and unexpected and difficult to make sense of. And an evolutionary framework prompts us to seek explanations for these strange and unexpected forms. So what is going on here with all these appendages on this organism? Are they functional, an adaptation? Are they the result of some weird parasite or infection? And if they're adaptive, what function could they serve? They aren't for propulsion, it seems, because the animal can't move them. And if anything, they're going to slow it down. Are they signaling or something? So how do we make sense of this initially weird-looking animal? Well, if we place it in its environment, in context, it starts to make perfect sense. It's exquisitely well designed for staying camouflaged in leafy kelp where it lives. It's called the leafy sea dragon. And it's extremely important if you're a slow sea creature at the bottom of the food chain that other animals can't see you. So we can make sense of it, in this case, as an adaptation. And other seahorses are equally well adapted. This cute little fellow is a pygmy coral seahorse. And without these explanations, the world just looks weird. So what I'd like to do is talk about how evolutionary theory can be applied in a similar way to religion. Religion's a difficult problem for evolutionists. Why do people dress up and perform rituals with no clear causal link to their professed aims? Another example. Why do they devote vast resources to supernatural beings, like these offerings in Bali? Why do they submit to huge and inconvenient demands on their time, praying here 5 times a day? And why do followers of religion endure painful procedures and with the risk of infection or even death? So this tribesman's undergone a scarification ritual, deliberately creating open wounds that scar and, as they heal, create this pattern. Permanent disfigurement, and sometimes people die from these rituals. In evolutionary terms, particularly puzzling, this one. Why forego the chance of reproduction by taking a vow of celibacy? And it's not just behaviors that are puzzling. Why do people believe in events that defy all natural laws by definition? And why do people believe in God or gods who they have never seen? From an evolutionary perspective, many religious beliefs and practices seem highly maladaptive. And the puzzle is that despite this, religion is pretty much ubiquitous. It is everywhere in a diverse array of forms. And also puzzling, some religious traditions have been incredibly successful at spreading over the last few hundred or thousand years. There are thousands of religions in the world today, and there have been thousands more. But in 1900, for example, 45% of all the people on the planet followed one of two traditions. They were either Christian or Muslim. And this trend, well, this isn't going away. This is, if anything, increasing the support for Christian and Muslim religions. 2005, 55% of the world population now follows these traditions. So can evolution explain the ubiquity of religion, and can it explain the phenomenal success of the Abrahamic traditions here, Muslim or Islam and Christianity? For much of the last century, scholars pretty much ignored this question. That's religion, we don't need to explain it, it's something else from science. But that's changing. More recently, evolutionists have begun to ask ultimate evolutionary questions about religion. So what I want to go over tonight is just a taster of some of the evolutionary approaches to religion. Questions like, is religion, or is a particular religious trait a byproduct of other cognitive mechanisms, or is it a functional adaptation? And if it is functional, what does it do? And cui bono, as Dan Dennett puts it, which is who benefits from the behavior? Is it an individual or a group? And is the information inherited genetically or culturally? So I wanted to start here in a cathedral and talk about spandrels. So the conventional view in the cognitive science of religion is that religion represents a cognitive byproduct. And evolutionists call these spandrels. The phrase was coined by Gould and Lewontin in their landmark paper, The Spandrels of San Marco and the Panglossian Paradigm. And what they were concerned about was the adaptationist program in evolutionary biology that was looking for adaptive explanations for just about anything. And they pointed out that not everything need be an adaptation. Some things are byproducts of other functional features of an organism. And so they make the analogy with spandrels in architecture. So you can have these functional arches in a cathedral that help hold it up. And that creates as a byproduct this space in between the arches, which architects call spandrels. And as they point out here in this quote, you might look at the spandrel and think that that was kind of the raison d'etre for the structure, that this was the reason for it being as it is, but in fact this is just an artifact. So they say the design is so elaborate, harmonious, and purposeful that we are tempted to view it as the starting point of any analysis, as the cause in some sense of the surrounding architecture. But this would invert the proper path of analysis. The system begins with an architectural constraint, the necessary for spandrels and their tapering triangular form. They provide a space in which the mosaicists work, they set the quadripartite symmetry of the dome above. So you can see that here. So do we see elements of the cognitive architecture of our minds that might produce religion or religious-like behavior as a spandrel? And a number of such elements have been put forward. So one, although he didn't come up with the idea, Justin Barrett did coin this term, the hyperactive agency detection device, which is this idea that we're hyper-attuned to finding agency in the world around us. And we can come up with an evolutionary explanation for why that might be a good thing using error management theory. So you can imagine you're in the forest somewhere and you hear a noise behind you or somewhere off in the distance, whatever, and you have to ask yourself a question. Is there a predator there or some kind of agent? Lion, tiger, someone from another tribe. And so you've got two options. Yes, there is, or no, there isn't. And the reality is going to be yes, there is, or no, there isn't. Now, ideally, you want to design some system that can correctly infer when there is really an agent there, you're going to judge that yes, there is. And when there isn't really an agent there, you're going to judge that no, there isn't. But no system's perfect, and you're going to get some errors. And what error management theory says is that when there's an asymmetry in the cost of the errors, you're going to get a bias in the cognition. So if you make a false positive judgment, which is saying there's a predator there or some agent, when there really isn't, that's a type 1 error. And the consequences of that is maybe there's some time lost checking or worrying about the predator or running away. But it's not hugely costly. If you make a false negative judgment when there is a predator there, but you think there isn't, then that could be rather consequential. You could get attacked, robbed, killed. So the argument goes, our mind, if anything, should be designed to be biased towards false positives and against, so that we avoid these false negatives. So we're going to be hyperactive agency detectors. We're going to see agency sometimes when it's not there. As Stuart Guthrie puts it, we're going to see faces in the clouds. And he's written a book about this idea and the extent to which it can explain religious beliefs. So his version of this error management equation is that it's better for a hiker to mistake a boulder for a bear than a bear for a boulder. And he goes on to say, which I quite like, that we make this mistake not of the emperor having no clothes, but clothes having no emperor. So we're always looking for agency in the world around us, and we tend to see it when it's not there. Deb Kellerman, a developmental psychologist, has looked at what she calls intuitive theism. This is another bias that we seem to have, involving agency, but also intentionality. So she asked, in one study, 7 to 8-year-old children, why are rocks pointy? And gave them two options. A, because bits of stuff piled up for a long period of time, or B, so that animals could scratch on them when they got itchy. And children overwhelmingly prefer B. And even when, in another condition in the experiment, she explains to the children the physical process of how rocks become pointy, they still favored the explanation that animals can scratch on them when they get itchy. So she argues that from a young age, we're intuitive theists. We want to imbue the world around us with intentionality. Another example of a cognitive byproduct approach is Pascal Boyer, who's interested in the relationship between pathogen avoidance systems and religion. So one kind of byproduct of our pathogen avoidance system is that it requires that we're hypervigilant for cleanliness and purity and order, and that can, in a overemphasized form, create obsessive compulsive disorder, where you get preoccupation with repetition, order, cleanliness, purity. It's associated with averting danger and averting some invisible threat. It's usually time critical. There's a sense of urgency with these actions. And Boyer argues that those features are also found in a lot of religious rituals around the world. Focus on repetition, order, cleanliness, purity, some kind of averting danger or an invisible threat, and they're often time critical. So he argues that both of these things are cognitive byproducts of the same underlying architecture, a pathogen avoidance system that's focused on making sure we don't come into contact or limit our contact with different pathogens. So there's a number of cognitive biases that could generate religious-like, I think you can see how that could generate religious-like behavior or thoughts as a byproduct of other functions. Another feature of our mind that makes us vulnerable to the spread of these ideas, so not just that we come up with them ourselves, but that we're willing to take them seriously when we come across them in others, is over-imitation. So this is a big area, and I could talk for a long time about it, but I'm just going to explain one simple experiment that I think gives the idea. And this was an experiment that was done on chimpanzees and children. And what they did was they gave, I don't know how well you can see this, they gave the chimpanzees a little puzzle box like this, and children separately, and then demonstrated an elaborate solution for extracting the reward, some small food reward. And the solution involved doing all sorts of things that you didn't have to actually do to get the reward out. But that was demonstrated. And then they had two conditions. One was an opaque box where you couldn't see what was going on inside, and another was a clear box where you could see the mechanism. And in the causally opaque condition, what they found was chimpanzees and children just reproduced the relevant and the irrelevant actions that they'd been shown. So they're copying. Humans do that, chimpanzees do that. What was interesting is that in the causally clear condition, the chimpanzees were smart enough to stop doing all the irrelevant actions. They worked out exactly what you have to do to get the food, and that's all they did. But the children went on copying the relevant and the irrelevant behaviors. They're over-imitators. And you might wonder, like, why are we doing that? I thought we were smarter than chimpanzees. Well, chimpanzees, they're pretty smart, but their culture is pretty limited, and they don't have a huge amount to learn from one another by copying. They're probably, most of the time, better off working things out for themselves. By contrast, humans live in these highly elaborate cultures where all sorts of things are going on, all sorts of information is present, that's very difficult for an individual to learn. So in chimpanzee world, it's not adaptive to copy indiscriminately. In the human world, young children, it's more adaptive. Maybe you don't want to be completely indiscriminate. But it makes more sense to just copy what other people are doing, because probably they're doing it for a good reason. And the culture that you're surrounded by is complex and you can't expect to understand it all. So just the default should be copy what everyone else is doing. So that's served us well as a species because it's allowed our culture to increase and increase in complexity as we learn from one another, copying what they do. But it's a double-edged sword. We're hypersocial, so we're seeing agents and intentionality all in the world all around us. And we're over-imitators. So we copy first and ask questions later. That helps us extract information from those around us, but it makes us vulnerable to the mistakes of those around us as well. So that leads us to a kind of second sort of explanation for the evolution of religion, which goes beyond mere byproducts. So you can explain a lot of behaviors perhaps as byproducts based on the kind of cognition I've just been talking about. But probably you're not satisfied that that explains a lot of religious behavior. So another approach is epitomized by Dan Dennett's work in this really interesting book I really recommend it, Breaking the Spell. And he likens religious behaviors to the behavior common among some ants of climbing to the top of a tall blade of grass, like on the cover of the book here, and they just wait there. They kind of stall. That's it. They just wait at the top of the tall blade of grass. That's a bit of a problem, bit of a puzzle for evolutionary biologists why an ant would do that. Until you realize, as Dennett describes, that there's no biological benefit that's accruing to the ant. That's the wrong question to ask. It is not trying to get a better view of the territory or seeking food. Turns out its brain has been commandeered by a tiny parasite, a lancet fluke, that needs to get itself into the stomach of a sheep or cow. And so it's sort of, this lancet fluke is controlling the ant like some robot going up the top of the blade of grass and waiting there to be ingested by a cow, and then the lancet fluke can continue its life cycle. So in a world where there's all this cultural information out there, and if we're over-imitating, we're vulnerable to cultural variants that behave like parasites, that just replicate. Those that are most common are going to replicate, be copied, and the ones that are copied most easily or most readily, the ones that appeal to whatever cognitive biases we have, whether they're good for us or not, are going to spread faster than those that don't appeal. And so the argument goes, religious traditions can exploit this and might emerge as parasites on our brains, on our minds. So the idea is that those that are best infecting our minds are going to survive and reproduce. And it seems like some features of religion, this is particularly easy to do for the major world religions, that have spread really successfully, do show elements of design for replication. You can think about them as parasites. They have mechanisms for checking copying fidelity. They have a sacred text that you're not allowed to change, prohibitions against questioning the tenets of the religion. You can imagine this might be like some kind of DNA repair mechanism, prescriptions against tolerance towards other worldviews. And they also seem to have design features to promote replication. So there's some kind of mission or conversion system and exhortations to be fruitful and multiply. So, so this is a fairly common, popular view at the moment of how we can explain a lot of features of religion. Dan Dennett seems to argue for a view a bit like this. Richard Dawkins readily refers to religion as a parasite on our minds. But is it the whole story? Is that, should we be satisfied with a religion as a parasite explanation? And here's a figure that suggests it's not the whole story. In fact, it might be kind of backwards. So this is Richard Sosis here. And he came across a really fascinating data set of 19th century communes. Turns out there are hundreds of communes in the US in the 19th century. And we have records of how long they lasted, how many members there were, and a whole lot of features about their beliefs. So Richard came up with the idea that we could use this to test some hypotheses about what's important for the success of groups like this, communes. And what he found, so this graph shows how this is the survival probability on the y-axis through time from 0 to 100 years for these different communes. It's kind of low-res graph, but I think you probably make sense of these two lines here. One is the line for the religious communes, so communes with an explicitly religious foundation, and the other is for the secular communes. And for any point in time, the religious communes had a much higher survival probability. They were about 4 times more likely to survive in any one year. That's a pretty big difference. So what's going on there? Well, there are probably a number of things going on there, but one of the things that Sosis was able to look at was the number of costly requirements that each commune asked of its members. So these were things like restrictions on coffee, alcohol, tobacco, meat consumption, clothing, hairstyle, jewelry, communication with the outside, marriage, sex, family structure, all sorts of prescriptions. And what he found was that those communes that asked the most of the members, controlling for commune size and wealth and a number of other factors, the ones that asked the most lasted the longest. But this effect was only found in the religious communes. So religious communes asked about twice as much in terms of these restrictions as non-religious, but non-religious also asked their members to make some kinds of sacrifice. But for the religious communes, it had a big effect on how long they lasted, more requirements, longer lasting. For the secular communes, no effect. So the secular communes could ask someone to give up alcohol, tobacco, or gambling or whatever. Didn't improve their survival. So what can we take away from this? Well, first, it's interesting because it means many of the apparently costly things that religions ask followers to do may be functional. It might be that they somehow galvanize the group. And so supporting this thesis, Richard Sosis went on to look at the societies around the world where you see these kind of costly rituals. I'm going to show you another one. If you're squeamish, look away. This is a really quite obvious display of just, why would you do that? Like, it just doesn't make any sense. Unless you're demonstrating your commitment to the group, perhaps. So societies that have more of these costly rituals are more likely to be involved in intertribal, but not within tribe, warfare. And that's a fairly clear example of group competition. So the argument goes, this somehow galvanizes the group. Obviously here there's some fairly clear markers of group membership that would be difficult to erase. And these things would be then functional. And the second lesson is that this costly signaling effect you only get for religions. So there's something about religions that is different to secular groups. So we should be looking for some other feature as well. So what special powers might religion have, and where should we look for them? So that brings me to a third collection of explanations for religion that draw on cultural group selection. This is David Sloan Wilson, who sort of promoted this view that the most successful religions and the ones that we tend to see in the world today are those that are able to most efficiently serve group interests. There were, so if we just look at the Abrahamic traditions, we have today the two main traditions, Christianity and Islam, and of course Judaism is another one. But over the course of the last few hundred years, thousand years, there have been hundreds and hundreds of offshoots of those traditions. And Wilson argues a kind of selection process. So they were trying out all sorts of different ways of doing things or believing things. And the ones we see today are the most successful variants. So those costly rituals might work in small communes or small tribal societies, but it's hard to see how they could unite a large group of people. You're not going to get 1 million folk together to share in some ritual. So that's prompted folk to look for other possible pro-social mechanisms in religion. And one that's been put forward is to do with supernatural beliefs. So it might surprise some of you to realize that there's a lot of variation in religions and the link between supernatural agents, belief in gods and that kind of thing, and the extent to which those gods or other supernatural agents are interested in human morality. It's not universally the case that religious supernatural agents are interested in human morality. And there's growing interest in this idea that's been dubbed, or a version of, the supernatural punishment hypothesis. And that's the idea that belief in a deity can discourage people from violating social norms and so provide a kind of supernatural police force. It doesn't matter whether or not the supernatural being actually exists. The point is that everyone believes that they exist. And so by supplying this kind of free enforcement system, the threat of supernatural punishment allows the group to cooperate and maybe grow larger and expand. And there's some experimental support for that something like this should work in our psychology, or on our psychology. So one nice study by Rigdon et al., they found that if you're asked whether or not you want to donate some of your earnings from the experiment to a particular charity, you're more likely to donate if this is on the page in front of you than if this is on the page in front of you. And their argument is that we're affected by subtle cues, facial cues, that then tap into our reputation management system. So we're subconsciously feeling watched when we see this image but not this image. And then we're more likely to behave pro-socially. This is another nice example of the effect of the perception that you're being monitored on pro-sociality. So this was done in a psychology department in the UK, in their tea room. And what they did was, there was an honesty system for the tea and coffee. If you have a cup, you need to put whatever it was, 10 or 20p or whatever, in the honesty box. And so there's the opportunity to cheat there and just take your coffee or tea without contributing. But what the experimenters did was just put up a poster next to the coffee machine saying, this is the system. You've got to, if you want some coffee or tea, put in 10p. And on the poster was an image either of eyes or flowers was the kind of control image. And they did this over a number of weeks here. And this graph shows the average pounds paid per litre of milk consumed. So they weren't stuck in the coffee room measuring how many people came in and how much coffee they drank. They just, at the end of the day, measured how much milk had been drunk, and that was their proxy for how much coffee there was, and then divide that by the number of pounds collected, and they get a measure for pounds per litre of milk. And in weeks when there were eyes on the poster, they had much higher rates of contribution. They get this nice, pretty convincing pattern alternating between monitored and non-monitored conditions. So they argue we're really super sensitive to these monitoring cues. In another experiment, getting a bit closer to religion now, children told there is an invisible princess in the room. And then they're told, okay, I'm going to leave the room now. Whatever you do, don't look in that box. And of course, the children really want to then look in the box. So if they're told there's an invisible princess in the room, they're much less likely to cheat and look in the box than if they're not told about the princess. And adults too, told that the ghost of a former lab technician has been seen in the room, are less likely to cheat on a test. So if such subtle monitoring cues, and here this is getting into the realm of supernatural, can affect prosocial tendencies, then it seems plausible that strongly held beliefs in some ever-present deity that's watching over you and will punish you if you step out of line could affect our behavior. So now firmly in the realm of looking at the prosocial effects of religion, in 2007, Sharif and Norenzayan published this paper where they got people to play an economic game where they could behave selfishly and keep money for themselves, or behave altruistically and give money to someone else. And they had a prime that involved just, it was like a word task that was either neutral words or religious-themed words. And then the dependent variable was how much was offered in this economic game. And what they found was this big difference. So neutral condition offers $2.56, religious prime $4.56, and highly significant difference. Interestingly though, a second experiment they did primed not religion, but secular institutions associated with morality, like judge, jury, police, whatever. They got a similar effect. So religion, you get a shift towards prosociality, but you also get that from their secular prime. So one of the things that suggests is, well, this might be nothing to do with monitoring then and supernatural punishment. It could just be religion. People tend to associate it with morality, doing good. So maybe priming religion just primes that feeling, and same way with priming secular institutions, primes the idea of morality and doing good. But one reason to think that's not all that was going on is this effect, the religious effect, is highly robust among believers, but it's a little flaky among non-believers. And the authors have done some follow-up studies trying to work out what's going on here. When they did the study on undergraduates, they got an effect of the religious prime on professed non-believers, professed atheists. But when they did it on adults and a couple of other populations, the atheists showed no effect. Now, they argue that some of the supposed atheists in their undergraduate sample were maybe identified with atheism, but maybe not true non-believers. Now, you can decide for yourselves whether you think that's special pleading. But the robust effect is only among believers. So they argue it's not just an association of morality with religion. You have to actually believe that there's some being actually there. This study was carried out in Canada, where secular authorities are pretty strong. Because one question you might ask, well, what's so special about religion? If we get the same effect with secular institutions, why bother with all the religious mumbo-jumbo? We should just have secular institutions. And that works in Canada, where there's these really strong institutions. But it's not clear it would work outside Canada, where there aren't strong institutions that people trust. Imagine putting up an image or priming the idea of the police or the jury or judge in a country where those things are inherently viewed as corrupt. So it could be really useful to be able to prime something supernatural that has this effect without actually having to maintain functioning secular institutions. So one of the things, one of the pieces of research I'm involved in at the moment is to look at how an experiment a bit like that one plays out in different cultures around the world. As part of this Cultural Evolution of Religion Consortium, there's a group of us in a number of countries, or working with a number of populations around the world. And we're going to, or have done and are continuing to run these kind of studies and see to what extent the specific religious beliefs, the characteristics of the supernatural gods, the social context affects how religion does or doesn't influence our behavior. And the second question that comes out of this is, okay, so there's good evidence that there's some psychological effects of priming religion or supernatural beings on our behavior, but does this translate into meaningful effects at the group level over the course of human history? Has this really had an effect, or is this just some freakish thing we can get in the lab? Does shared belief in a God really help a society to grow? And can an extremely powerful, all-knowing God explain the success, for example, of the Abrahamic traditions? So there's a number of studies looking at this question. I've dabbled in it a bit myself. My own work with Pierrick Biorat has shown that across 87 countries, people who believe in God rate moral transgressions like cheating on taxes, lying, skipping a bus fare, or stealing a car as less justifiable if they believe in God. And there's an independent effect. If that God is a personal God rather than some amorphous spirit, the effect is stronger. And there's also an independent effect of belief in heaven and hell. So those things, it's just a correlational study, but that's suggestive that there might be something there across societies. Also, Azim Sharif has shown that countries with higher rates of belief in hell, but not in heaven, have lower national crime statistics. So that's kind of interesting. Again, correlational. Both those studies come from industrialized societies, or modern literate people are doing the surveys. What about traditional societies? So there's actually a fairly long tradition looking at the cross-cultural correlates of religious beliefs and practices. In 1964, Swanson was interested in moralizing high gods. And so he coded up for societies in the standard cross-cultural survey. It's about 170 societies from around the world, traditional societies. Whether or not they had different types of high gods. So the gods were either absent, They were present, but they weren't active in human affairs. They were present, active in human affairs, but not supportive of human morality. Or they were present, active in human affairs, and supportive of human morality. So he categorized these gods in a number of societies. And he found that this correlates with greater political complexity. It's consistent with the explanation that the higher gods, particularly the ones supportive of human morality, might allow larger scale societies. And this has been looked at with a number of other variables as well, so using those same sort of classifications for moralizing high gods. Sneri showed that they were associated with higher rates of water scarcity, which is argued to be an ecological condition that requires more cooperation. They're present in just larger societies. And Johnson has argued that there's a correlation with money, credit systems, increased taxation, policing, and some measures of norm compliance. So all these relationships are cited as supporting this claim that shared belief in this powerful God can increase pro-social behavior and would facilitate large-scale cooperation in humans. And most recently, Aaron Zion at the University of British Columbia has written this book, Big Gods, How Religion Transformed Cooperation and Conflict. It's a good read. And so these general patterns are taken to support cultural group selection arguments. So that's the sort of David Sloan Wilson argument that the competitive advantage given to groups who have this powerful God that's going to punish people allows them to increase in scale and expand, and that's why we see exactly these kind of gods in the major world religions that are so successful now. So under this view, you can think of these powerful moralizing gods as a kind of social technology that's been developed by a cultural group selection to galvanize and build groups. So I'm going to stop talking soon, and I'd like to be able to say that that's the end of the story. Isn't that a nice story, that it's pointing towards the role of these gods in promoting large-scale cooperation? There are some caveats, though. So with Andrew Latham and Joseph Watts, we took a closer look at some of the data that supports or is claimed to support these relationships, and found a few holes in some of the analyses. One of the main issues is that you can just kind of see, looking at this graph, that so this shows red points here are the supposed, well, they are the moralizing high gods, these gods that care what you've been doing and will punish you if you step out of line. The blue dots are other societies, but they're not randomly distributed across the world. There's an obvious cluster here, and it's obvious what that cluster is. It's the Abrahamic traditions that have spread out, Christianity and Islam. And that's important because it means these are all not independent data points, but when the data was analyzed, they were treated as independent data points. Maybe we've got some independent data points here, these other red dots scattered around the world. But when we looked at these cases, looked up the ethnographies, they're not particularly convincing examples of independent moralizing high gods. They either had a lot of missionary contact before the ethnographers arrived, so there's a good chance that they'd just borrowed this idea of a super powerful god, or there's just not good evidence for a moralizing high god there. So the problem is that if all these examples are essentially Christian or Islam, then the correlations being reported don't necessarily tell us anything about these moralizing high gods, because there's all sorts of features that went along with the expansion of Christianity and Islam. There are the features of those religions that so there may be other features of those religions that have this effect that we're seeing. Active proselytization, a universal rather than ethnocentric ideology, a sacred text containing a strict moral code, exhortations to be fruitful and multiply, exclusivity of a single God. So there's other possibilities there, but also these cultures spread with colonialism and a whole lot of other technologies that may have had just as much to do with the growth of whatever cultures we find them in today. And second consideration is that whatever you think about the independence of the data points, it's correlational data. So it can't tell us which way the causal arrow points. One way around this that we're working on in the lab at the moment, this is some work that Joseph Watts is doing, is to try and reconstruct the evolution of these traits that we're interested in through time on a cultural phylogeny. And we can test whether one trait makes another more likely through time in much the same way that the evolutionary biologists can test these hypotheses about species evolution. So this is a Austronesian language tree. Describes the relationships between all these populations based on the language, on data on the languages that they speak. Basically, more closely related languages are more similar. And mapped onto this tree are the societies that have high political complexity. So you can see there's a few clusters there. Now the point is you can marry that up with data on where we see the big, powerful gods in these cultures. And you can just tell, looking at this, that there's not an amazing correspondence between the complex societies and the high gods. And if anything, when we do fit a mathematical model to this and ask, well, what's more likely to come first, the model supports the emergence of political complexity, and then you get the big gods. So that would suggest it's not the gods promoting cooperation and allowing a society to get big, it's that a society gets big and then it invents big gods, maybe as a reflection of their secular political system. Okay, so that kind of unfortunately dampens the cross-cultural support for this proposal. But I guess my take-home message is that in the face of some uncertainty, while some religions or some aspects of religion may behave like parasites, exploiting our minds to replicate and offering nothing in return, some may in fact be beneficial, culturally selected to help us cooperate in large groups. And from the looks of these last couple of findings I showed you, more cross-cultural work is going to be needed to determine how important these moralizing big gods have been in human prehistory. But I think the experimental evidence is pretty intriguing and does indicate that supernatural monitoring could have plausible pro-social effects on our behavior. So I expect extolling the benefits of belief in a God doesn't sit well with some of you in the Reason and Science Society. But I think whatever you believe about the ontological status of supernatural beings, it matters if these beings can promote cooperation. It matters that they may have provided a ladder of social technologies that have helped us progress from small hunter-gatherer groups to large bands or even nation-states. In modern society, secular systems of enforcement and security mean that a lot of us feel comfortable kicking away this ladder of support. But we should do so knowing that there may well be real gaps to fill. And I think the best way to promote reason and science over superstition and faith is to build strong secular institutions that can provide the same kinds of perceived and probably actual benefits as the traditions that they aim to replace. So thank you. Okay.
You said that belief in gods correlates with not being okay with stealing and lying and cheating in that study. How do you explain Congress?
So,
That's only part half the statement.
yeah, I don't know. I mean, good point. I don't know. These things are all relative. Like, who knows? Maybe it would be all the worse without these people. Yeah.
Just about that one study with the people, were religion and priming with religion and priming with secular institutions. The Canadian study.
Mm-hmm.
Has that been repeated much out in other countries?
So that's one of the things that we're doing as part of this cultural evolution of religion consortium.
Has it actually started up? I mean, has anything come out of that yet?
There's not a systematic repetition of that yet. So we've got a big data set that we haven't analyzed yet. We ran studies in Vanuatu looking at this question. But I do know that Norin Zion's done a big meta-analysis of all the studies that have been done, mostly in Western industrialized cultures. And they found that the effect is robust across those societies. Yeah.
Politics and the positions, the right and the left, is there correlation between how their religion sort of difference? So the ideology of the left might be one type of religion and the ideology of the right might be another type of religion.
Yeah. There's...
Because it seems to be how what happens in politics.
So you're saying, in terms of the correlation between the left-right political spectrum and religious beliefs proper, or whether people view their political beliefs as like a religion? Yeah.
Could the parasitic model be put on that?
Well, maybe some of us would like to. I think so maybe what I didn't stress was that there are many different components to religion, and I think it's wrong to try and look for one explanation for all of it. And likewise, there being many components, many of those components can be seen in other elements of human life, including perhaps politics. And so I think, yeah, maybe you could apply some of those ideas to, I mean, there's definitely an element of group identity and tribalism in politics, and that's probably got a lot of overlap with religious identification and identity and tribalism, yeah.
I think there's a lot of things that are being sort of as one thing. So at the end you're talking about the idea of a moralizing big God. And then you started off looking at things like scarification. So there's like a sort of a behavior, and there's what people say on a survey that their religion is. And it's like this idea of a moralizing big God. And they all seem to me to be potentially quite different things. And
Yeah.
kind of put them all together and think that there's an evolutionary explanation of that seems kind of weird. Like trying to offer an evolutionary explanation of worms or something like that. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, well, I guess that's just what I was saying, but it's many different things, and we should be looking for explanations for all those components. Yeah. Yeah, which is what I think a lot of those studies were doing. So they're saying, well, how do we explain these incredibly costly rituals? Or how do we explain belief in a supernatural agent that will punish you if you step out of line? Yeah.
and then that will say what that implies for the idea of moralizing big gods.
Yeah.
When you feel like what's happening in certain parts of the world now, where there's different factions fighting quite severely with each other, surely that's, as an evolutionary, it's not an advantage to be doing that, or is it just for that religion? Is that's like a meme
Well, yeah. So, I mean, I don't know. There are a number of ways you could try and explain that. And there are a number of ways you can try and explain that in evolutionary terms. You could try and explain it in terms of a parasite that's infected the minds of those people and is getting them to do things that are not in their interests.
Well, it's not an evolutionary advantage to be battling each other.
Well, you could also try and explain it in terms of there are groups there that are really battling over scarce resources, and passionate commitment to a religious ideology is a good way of galvanizing the group and getting them to potentially sacrifice themselves for the group's interest. Yeah.
But someone is gaining power from it too, so
Yeah.
there's that sort of dynamic as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a complicated. If I could stand up here and say this is what's happening in the Middle East, for example, then yeah, I'd probably win a Nobel Prize, right? Yeah, there's a lot going on, and a lot of it's. I think you can make sense of some of it in these terms. Yeah.
Can you say anything about the difference between a biological adaptation and a cultural adaptation? Because they just seem to be all just adaptations of merged together.
Yeah. So, well, biological adaptations are going to be in the genetic interests of the individuals, and cultural adaptations. You can there are maybe two types of cultural adaptations you can think of. One is culturally inherited traits that are for the benefit of, that are selected because they incur a benefit on the individuals who believe those, or the groups that believe those traits. But there's another type of culturally selected trait, which is just those cultural traits that are selected because they're good at being copied into other brains, basically. And there's no reason to think that they need to be in the interests selected for the survival interests of the individuals whose brains they're inhabiting. They could be like a parasite. Does that answer your question?
How do you sort out those two? You just look at things that don't seem beneficial and say those must be beings.
Yeah, it's not easy to do, to test adaptive hypotheses, but there's a sort of checklist, if you like, of things that a biologist would want to know before saying something was adaptive, so that it does, for example, increase survival or reproduction rates, that it's maybe that you can predict its distribution based on what you think it is functional for. So, like the water scarcity argument that if you think something is imperative for cooperating to manage a scarce resource, then you should see it more regularly in areas where resources are scarce. So there's a number of pieces of evidence you'd have to put together. And I think it's analogous argument whether you're considering culture as parasite or culture as individually or group inherited trait or genetically inherited. Yeah.
Related. So I'm interested in the use of the word parasite. So for the ant on the blade of grass, we can clearly see that the ant is not getting out anything out of this food it is. But, you know, we've all got in our guts lots of bacteria that are non-human, that are helpers. Is there a really very clear definition of what a parasite is, or because of the absence of other knowledge, we might think that something is doing bad, but then with further knowledge in the future, this makes it actually a good thing. So can you ever be confident in saying something is a parasite rather than parasites?
Well, I think you could test the parasite explanation. I think you're right that just by virtue of living off some other organism in some way, it doesn't make something a parasite in the sense that it doesn't have to have negative effects. It could be some kind of symbiotic relationship. And I think these explanations of religion needn't be mutually exclusive. So it could be that there's elements of cultural replication and cultural selection in a parasite-like way, like as an analogy, or maybe you'd want to think of it as a virus or something, but that there could be positive effects that, you know, it might actually help people get along, for example, or reduce stress. Something I didn't have time to talk about was the link between religious belief and more positive health outcomes. Is a potential individual level selection argument. Yeah?
What do you think about the God gene?
The God gene?
Yep.
I think it's a good headline, but it doesn't really mean anything. If there was some specific claim involving a God gene, maybe I'd have an opinion on that, but I don't. Yeah.
You mentioned before that humans are prone to certain biases, pathogen avoidance systems, and orientation. Would that mean that true atheists are less prone to such biases?
Yeah, possibly. There are some people looking at this kind of thing. There's interesting associations between religiosity and how you react to disgusting stimuli, for example, which would fit with some kind of link with the pathogen avoidance system. It's also linked to political attitudes. And another interesting finding is a link between some forms of religiosity and some political attitudes and threat. So, for example, people who hold traditionally conservative views in the US, if you play the sound of a gunshot while they're in the lab, their startle reflex is much greater than that of liberals. So there's something really basic and physiological going on there as well. This is obviously, this is just on average, there's a lot of variation, but it's interesting.
So would that mean that it's an intrinsic property of a human?
Their
As in you're born in
religiosity.
Yes.
Yeah, well, it's you need to be careful what you mean by that. Like, to what what do you mean by an intrinsic property?
It's when someone is born, they would be more prone to become
Yeah.
religious.
Yeah, I think that's probably borne out. I don't know of work looking at that in particular. I do know there's heritability studies of political attitudes and religiosity, twin studies where twins are raised separately, and these things are definitely heritable. Yeah.
Just science, and then as we move forward, I mean, the Greeks with their gods on the mountaintops, you go up there, there's no one there, and as we've developed and moved along, we're not seeing these deities. So what is driving people? Is it ignorance or not education, or is it just what is making what's happening there? I mean, we're advancing with our technologies and our sciences. Why is this the religion? Why they still got such a grip on it?
Yes, that is a very good question. I think, what do I think? That there are these. You can think of if religion has evolved culturally to be passed on from one generation to the next, then the kinds of beliefs that would have been passed on easily would have been selected for. So there's all these beliefs that are just very easy to acquire. They tickle the right bits of our brain. They appeal to the intuitive theist in us and our willingness to see agency in the world. And so against that, you have this scientific approach, which has, I think I can say this. It has truth on its side, or that's what it's supposed to be founded on. But truth is often not very intuitive, right? Like it's much. Try and explain quantum theory to someone or relativity. These things don't fit very well in our brains. So I think that's part of the problem, that the religion...
To Bedouin herdsmen 2,000 years ago, well, you probably would have, but today we're able to understand it by example and showing it.
Yeah.
So why is it difficult for people to say, well, there's the evidence?
Well, it's...
And ditch the other, in other words. Sort of say, well,
Yeah. I don't think it's so easy for people to... it takes many years of training and education to grasp a lot of these concepts. It's hard work. It's much easier to catch these sort of more intuitive explanations for things that might be wrong, but they sit easily. I also think the other side of it is that these beliefs aren't just out there in some abstract sense. They're tied to communities and give people a sense of meaning, and we're pretty good at convincing ourselves of stuff if it is convenient or easy or reassuring.
I actually just want to kind of respond to that. There's one thing, a lot of what you're saying is talking about how there are positive adaptations for it. And I think there's also a lot of evidence from Kahan and that group talking about how if you're part of an identity group and somebody comes along and tells you some information, and that information can be completely true, but if it undermines this shared identity that you have somehow, then you have, it's actually a positive advantage for you to dispute that truth. And so it doesn't even matter if religion is true or not. That's completely irrelevant to the question in this case. It would be just whether you're actually at an advantage to dispute it because you'd be promoting that social tie, just as the identity. And you'll be getting more advantage out of having that group identity than you would out of
confirmation
out of that
societies.
There's another thing as well. If you look at a lot of the religions that they've got a penalty if you leave them. That I'm not just talking about knocking people off with some extreme Muslim areas, but in terms of you're going to go to hell, that causes a lot of stress and anxiety to your loved ones.
Yeah.
By giving up, not just the community, but you're going to be killing people who you care about through a lot of stress. That means questioning that isn't really high on the priority list. It's easy just to accept. So it doesn't mean that but that's a truly emotional cost.
I just find it strange that as we have developed our science and we learn more about nature, what we are and where we are, and why these things are plunged so strongly. In light of the evidence is there.
One of the problems with that is that we really only had science and scientific method for a short amount of time. And if we've got this mechanism built into us to join groups, the survivalism that we have, to believe in whatever the group says is true as being true, it's hard to get away from that inbuilt mindset.
Well, what I'm asking is, what I'm kind of saying is that surely as we progress, that evolutionary psychological side of us will dissipate. Or do you think it would always stay there? Will we eventually?
We meet it with sports teams and
Well, yes. I mean,
sorry, I'm just going to interrupt because for those of you who aren't familiar with the RSS, at this point in the talks, we generally kind of devolve into just group discussion. So I'm just going to stand up and start moderating a little bit so it doesn't just get into a little bit. I'm seeing some people still trying to raise their hands, some people jumping in, so just wanted to get into that. Zach?
I guess Justin Barrett is popular book, Ordinary, suggests that there's kind of room for more cognitive, I guess, evolutionary psychology or atheism. Is that something that, is anyone kind of doing that? Is that something you see as valuable, or is it kind of redundant?
Yeah, I quite like that question. So Justin Barrett has written a book, Why Would Anyone Believe in God, I think is one of his books. And where he looks at the psychology underlying supernatural beliefs and God beliefs. He's a Christian himself, which is interesting in this field. But he's either, I don't know if he's published it yet or he's still working on it, but he has another manuscript, Why Would Anyone Not Believe in God, where he asks the same kind of questions about atheism. Yeah, I think you could, I guess it doesn't present the same puzzles, right? So that changes the nature of the task. But there's still some interesting questions to ask there. For example, the atheist movement is itself a community that has a whole lot of social psychology going on in it, and you could look at the extent to which, like what beliefs people profess to hold and actually hold in this community. Some nice work done in the cognitive science of religion showing that people, that there are a lot of religions out there have elaborate theologies and cosmologies, and often official versions that are written down and they're passed on via texts. But they're pretty crazy, weird, counterintuitive things themselves, right? Maybe not fitting with my case that religion is always intuitive. Like the Holy Trinity, for example, is this weird concept of like it's one thing, but it's three things. Who the heck knows what that is? Or the idea that God is everywhere and can see everything at all times is maybe not, doesn't fit with our normal conception of another agent that's usually limited in some way. But what they find is when you ask people to, for example, fill in stories about these agents, like the Holy Spirit or the Holy Trinity or God, or although they're explicitly aware of the official line, that, for example, God can see X or God knows Y, or the Holy Trinity is really one but three. When they're asked to apply these concepts or use them in some story or something, they make mistakes in line with just more intuitive reasoning. So they construct the story in a way where God is fallible in some sense, that he's officially not supposed to be, or that the Holy Trinity is really three different things when it's supposed to be one. Anyway, the point I'm getting at is you could maybe do the same kind of research on atheists and say, well, they, at some abstract level, claim these beliefs about the universe and everything in it, but how do they actually reason about the world in some, under some time pressure or something where you could. I think that would be interesting, and I don't know of anyone who's looked at that.
Sort of related to your question, but lots of countries that are secular, is there a pattern of why and how they become secular? Is there something that arises that turns them secular, or do they sort of, the North countries have beliefs, but they're not so secular now?
Yeah, they're really interesting because they have very high rates of church membership, but very high rates of atheism. I was in a theology department there, and that was kind of a strange theology department because most people were atheists. but yeah, because it's part of their culture. So, well, one explanation is, so religious belief correlates with GDP per capita, with wealth, basically. So maybe the better off countries are able to kind of assuage the existential fears of their citizens so they no longer cling to religion. And one interesting point... Yeah, higher GDP is less likely to be religious, more secular. And an interesting kind of exception that might prove the rule there is the United States, which has high GDP per capita, but relatively high rates of religious belief. What's interesting is the US does not offer the kind of social support mechanisms that, for example, the Scandinavian states do. So although it's high GDP per capita, it's not providing a safety net that makes people feel secure enough to abandon religion. That's one explanation.
Just following on that, the U.S. is not a large country both by population and geography. So if you divide it into subpopulations, I think you would probably, I mean, I don't actually know the statistics, but I think you would probably find the lower GDP of a certain section of the U.S., say the southern U.S., correlated with more religiosity. Just from what I know about the religious distribution within the states, whereas the New England states tend to have lower religious levels than the southern states, which also are poorer regions.
Yeah. There's some maps circulating online that show, I think by county level, the rates of religiosity across the US. And I've seen someone put one of these maps up and say it shows that religiosity is predicted by water, because it's on the coasts and along the rivers that you get the non-religious people. And yeah.
Isn't secularism a response to religious conflict? A way of listening it? Well, I think of the foundation of the United States in that way. Each separate state started off with its own religion, and when they came to unify, there was no good way of doing it except to acknowledge some form of secularism, which New Zealand has not yet done, but Fiji is ahead of us.
Yeah, well, so, oops, sorry. They were, yeah. Why was the US founded on those secular principles? I don't know. It could.
Went to different places, and
yeah.
When they decided to form the United States or have some form of federal government, they had to come to some agreement about what to do about religion. The best thing to do was to say, well, the state will have nothing to do with it. You go ahead and do whatever you want. And that's basically the answer.
And some of those groups also were fleeing persecution.
Yeah.
So there was fresh in their mind about what happens when they
ended
get
up in the United States, or before it became the United States.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't know. Then there's some of the personalities involved as well, like the extent to which they were religious. Lots of people have written about that.
And some of the founding fathers seem to have been quite agnostic, heading for atheistic. Yet they recognise this as a solution to the problem of different religions in different states.
But, I mean, on the other hand, the U.S. went through that long burned-over period where, because all the different religious sects and variations were in competition with each other, it was just flared over with, so many new sects developing, and for multiple times this kind of went through these resurgences. So, and I think that having multiple sects, it increases that competition and makes people much more religious over the long run. Whereas in states like Denmark, where you have a national church, mentioning, like, why do people stay in the church? Well, because you have to opt out brain, and so a lot of people just don't. So, you know, when you don't have that competition, when it's just this one church, then it feels less of a, I don't know, there's less marketing, I suppose, on behalf, there's less of that need to compete.
How successful has communism, because they don't really like religion, do they? And when communism pops up, it's like no more churches, state. How successful was that at reducing religion?
Well, there are higher rates of atheism in communist countries, but it's interesting that as soon as, like in the countries where the regime has ended, immediately you get, religion coming back. What's that?
Was communism not around for long enough for people to stop believing in that system? It's just talked about in practice.
Yeah, maybe, or maybe it's not meeting these. It doesn't mesh with our intuitive psychology. People want to live in a world with some agency and intentionality, and not some kind of abstract ideology.
Could you see communism as taking the role, like fulfilling some of the needs that you were saying that religion might provide?
I think it tried to, yeah. But it wasn't able to do that very effectively, it seems.
Well, sorry, wouldn't the example of the Nordic countries with their much more efficient social welfare system or social system as an example of not communism, but there's your secularism, and I guess within the communist states, the leaders were replacing the state with religion. So that was forced.
Did they do that because religion would threaten the state?
I would guess.
Yeah, I think so.
The current dominant religions now are one single god, but in the past there was multiple gods inside of one religion, like the Greek, the Egyptian, and the Norse. So is the change of format of the religion? I'm not sure if you. Is that one of the factors which is that changed by the development of our culture, or was it? Since you mentioned a correlation, you mentioned that religion might have driven cultural advancement. So was the change from multiple gods to a single all-powerful God, would that is that a result of cultural change, or did that drive?
So is it the cause or the effect of the cultural changes? Did
it influence it, or was it?
Well, I think that's the question. And one of the things I mentioned was because there's only really one big tradition of monotheism that's been successful, it's difficult to know what's made it successful. Is it just, or how big a factor was that it had one powerful God versus some of the other things that were associated with those traditions?
I think my question is more like, in the past, the dominant form was the multiple gods, and now it's one God. So would that mean our mindset or our cultural acceptability or something changed from the past to now?
Possibly. I mean, it is 55% of the world does think this way. So if that counts as a change of cultural mindset, then something's changed and continues to.
I don't know if I buy the entire monotheism thing, because although they say that there's one God, like with the Nordic, the Odin was the All-Father. He was the all-powerful God that all the other gods sprung from. And so there was normally a big guy at the top who was the source, and then you had all these minor gods. And so we just call those minor gods angels in Christianity. And you've got the angel of death, but it's basically they've taken more of a back seat and they've got a different title, but there's still another supernatural agent operating within in that area, independently of the actual God itself and the Holy Ghost. And the Holy Ghost.
But I think because Christianity, it focuses on one God, whereas if you look at Greek mythology or Egyptian mythology, it focuses on multiple different entities. So my question was more like why we changed our mindset from having a religion with multiple entities as a dominant form of religion to a single God, a single entity controlling everything as a form of religion.
You look at that also, like the Egyptians, they believed in other gods being around, and same thing with the Greek and the Roman. And they didn't really care if you worshipped another god, providing you paid your dues to deal with as well. Well, there's like a lot of intolerance with the Abrahamic religions that, no, this is the only one and everything else is false, it's not true. And so that's not accepting. So when they came over and took over Eden, they weren't really going to let, we're lucky now we have freedom of religion, so you can have those coexisting. But they stand around.
So it's just a matter of tolerance between different religions.
Yes.
Evolutionary psychology.
Mm-hmm.
It goes down cul-de-sacs. Are there any examples of cul-de-sacs? I mean, apart from religion comes up and rises down and goes into a cul-de-sac. Some religions have just gone, many religions have just vanished because they've been swamped by other religions. But as an evolutionary, are there any examples of where evolutionary psychology is it psychology? It's not.
Well, I don't really mind what it's called, but yeah, evolutionary psychology.
Because it's a relatively new field, isn't it? Sort of.
Yep.
Are there any cul-de-sacs that we can see examples where something's come up and just vanished away as we progressed? I mean, like some religions have come up and vanished.
Mm-hmm.
Would you call those cul-de-sacs and dead ends?
Some religions, or I don't. You mean, are there elements within evolutionary psychology, theories that have turned out not to be good at explaining?
See examples over history of being cul-de-sacs and the cycle.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of beliefs that turned out not to be right, despite being developed. I mean, there are classic examples in science as well, like phlogiston or.
Absolutely. But then that then science is different because it's self-corrects and the evidence with all. It's probably a silly question. I'm just trying to compare apples to.
Right. Yeah, well, I think there are all sorts of cultural traditions in all sorts of domains that end up not going anywhere. In fact, almost all end up disappearing at some point. The same with genetic lineages. Yeah.
Any other questions, points? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.